The dust-choked air of Redemption Creek seemed to have a way of suffocating hope just as effectively as it did clean linen. And Rebecca Turner was certain she'd breathed in more than her fair share. As the last shovelful of dirt fell upon her father's grave in the spring of 1875, she felt something vital inside her crumble alongside the clods of earth. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," the traveling preacher intoned, his words barely audible over the howling wind that swept across the Montana Territory. Rebecca stood motionless, her black mourning dress whipping against her legs. At 23, she had now buried both parents within the span of 2 years. Her mother had succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter, and now her father, the stalwart pillar of her existence, had been taken by a bullet meant for someone else during a saloon dispute. Miss Turner. Sheriff Dawson approached, hat in hand. "I'm mighty sorry about your pa. He was a good man." Rebecca nodded, unable to form words around the boulder lodged in her throat. Her father's small ranch, 50 acres of tough grassland with a modest cabin and a handful of cattle, was all she had left now. "If you need anything." The sheriff trailed off, knowing full well there was nothing he could offer that would matter. She watched as the small gathering of townspeople dispersed, returning to their lives while hers remained shattered at the bottom of a 6-foot hole. Only when she was alone did she finally speak. "You promised, Pa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You promised you wouldn't leave me too." The wind offered no reply, carrying her words away across the endless prairie. Rebecca Turner had been raised on faith, her mother's unwavering belief that God had a plan even when it wasn't clear, her father's quiet certainty that tomorrow would be better. But now, staring at the freshly turned earth, she found that faith had abandoned her, just as surely as everyone else had. With nothing left to say, she turned and walked the 3 miles back to the ranch alone. The next morning dawned cruel and bright, indifferent to her grief. Rebecca forced herself from the bed she'd barely slept in and moved through the cabin like a ghost. Her father's presence lingered everywhere, his coffee mug still sitting where he'd left it, his boots by the door, his Bible open on the small table. That Bible. She approached it slowly, running her fingers over the worn leather. How many times had she watched her father read from it in the evenings, finding comfort in its pages? How many times had her mother assured her that God was watching over them? In a sudden burst of anger, Rebecca slammed the book shut and shoved it into a drawer. What good was faith when it left you alone with nothing but a struggling ranch and debts you couldn't pay? The banking notice had arrived a week before her father's death. The loan they'd taken to survive the previous winter was coming due, and without her father's income from occasional work in town, Rebecca knew she couldn't meet it. 6 weeks. That's all the time she had before Mr. Hollister from the bank would come calling, ready to take everything her parents had built. Rebecca moved through the next days in a fog of grief and determination. She rose before dawn to tend the cattle, mended fences until her hands blistered, and collapsed into bed each night too exhausted to even cry. But no matter how hard she worked, the reality remained stark. A woman alone couldn't run a cattle ranch in this territory, not without help she couldn't afford to hire. 2 weeks after the funeral, Rebecca rode into Redemption Creek for supplies. The small frontier town consisted of little more than a main street with essential businesses: general store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and the bank that held her fate in its ledgers. As she tied her horse outside the general store, she noticed a commotion down the street. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon, voices raised in excitement. "Did you see him ride in? That's Ryder Forrester. Heard he took down 3 of the Jenkins gang single-handed down in Wyoming territory. What's a man like that doing in our little town?" Rebecca paid little mind to the gossip. Famous gunslingers and their exploits held no interest for her now. She had more pressing matters like how to stretch her meager coins to cover flour, coffee, and ammunition. Inside the general store, Mr. Peterson greeted her with the same pitying look she'd come to despise. "Rebecca, child, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing just fine, thank you," she replied stiffly, placing her list on the counter. As Peterson gathered her items, the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and a tall figure that seemed to darken the doorway entirely. The store fell silent as the man stepped inside. His spurs jingled softly against the wooden floor, the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, then quickly returned her attention to counting out coins. The newcomer wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, but there was something in his bearing that set him apart from the usual drifters. His dark hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could feel his presence like a change in the weather. "Afternoon," he greeted Peterson, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Forrester," Peterson replied with unusual deference. "What can I help you with today?" "Just need some supplies. Heading north to my uncle's place near the Blackfoot Reservation." Rebecca kept her head down, focusing on her transaction, though she could feel the stranger's gaze briefly touch upon her. She gathered her purchases quickly, anxious to leave the suddenly stifling store. As she reached for the door, her paper-wrapped bundle slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents across the floor. With a frustrated sigh, she knelt to gather them. A shadow fell over her as the stranger crouched beside her, his hands strong but surprisingly gentle, helping collect the scattered items. "Allow me, madam," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Rebecca looked up, finally meeting his eyes. They were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin and held none of the pity she'd grown so accustomed to seeing. Instead, she found something unexpected: respect. "Thank you, but I can manage," she said, more sharply than she'd intended. He nodded once and stepped back, respecting her space. As Rebecca hurriedly gathered her things and fled the store, she could feel those blue eyes following her, and something about that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The next day brought no relief from her worries. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture, but the work required at least 2 people to manage properly. Rebecca stubbornly attempted it alone, resulting in several beasts breaking away from the herd and her horse nearly throwing her when a rattlesnake startled it. By midday, she sat on a rock overlooking the scattered herd, her hat beside her, sweat dampening her hair despite the spring chill. Defeat pressed down on her like a physical weight. This was impossible. Everything was impossible now. "Looks like you could use a hand." The voice startled her, and Rebecca jumped to her feet, hand instinctively moving to the small pistol at her waist. The stranger from the general store sat atop a magnificent buckskin horse about 20 yards away. Up close and in the daylight, she could see him clearly: tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. His face was lean and weathered, but younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. "This is private property," she said firmly. He nodded, seemingly unperturbed by her hostility. "Ryder Forrester, madam. Sheriff Dawson mentioned you might need some help with your herd." Rebecca bristled. "Did he now? Well, you can ride back to town and tell the sheriff I don't need anyone's charity." "It's not charity I'm offering," Ryder replied evenly. "It's fair work for fair pay. I've got 2 weeks before I need to be up north, and I could use the coin." "I can't pay you," Rebecca admitted after a moment, hating the words as they left her mouth. "Not what your time would be worth." Ryder studied the scattered cattle, then looked back at her. "How about this? I help you get your herd in order, repair what needs repairing, and in exchange, you provide meals and a place to bed down in your barn until I move on. No coin needed." Rebecca wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to send this man on his way, but the reality of her situation was undeniable. Without help, she would lose everything before the bank even came to claim it. "Why would you offer that?" she asked suspiciously. "A man with your reputation could command good money elsewhere." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps I'm tired of the reputation, Miss Turner." The fact that he knew her name shouldn't have surprised her. Small towns held few secrets, but it did. "1 week, she finally said. "You can stay 1 week, and you sleep in the barn, not the house." "Yes, madam," he agreed, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. Without further discussion, he turned his horse toward the scattered cattle and began the work of gathering them, his skill immediately apparent. Rebecca watched him for a moment, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake before mounting her own horse to join him. 1 week, she told herself. She could endure anyone's company for 1 week. That evening, Rebecca found herself cooking for someone other than herself for the first time since her father's death. She'd spent the afternoon watching Ryder Forrester work his efficiency with the cattle, his gentle handling of the animals, the respectful way he listened when she explained how her father had run things. It was unsettling how easily he'd slipped into the rhythms of her ranch. Now he sat at the table outside the cabin, having washed up at the pump. His hair was damp, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. The fearsome gunslinger of reputation seemed transformed into something else entirely, a capable, quiet man who'd spent the day working honest labor without complaint. She placed a plate of beans, cornbread, and salt pork before him. "It's not much," she said, sitting across from him with her own plate. "It's more than fine, Miss Turner, thank you." He waited until she picked up her fork before beginning to eat, another small courtesy that caught her off guard. They ate in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "Your father built a good operation here, smaller than some but well planned. He worked hard," Rebecca replied, her throat tightening. "Every day of his life," Ryder nodded, "it shows." It wasn't enough, she found herself saying, the bitterness she'd been carrying spilling out. All that work, all that faith that things would get better, and he still ended up dead in a saloon over someone else's quarrel. She expected platitudes or awkward silence. Instead, Ryder met her gaze directly. "Sometimes the world doesn't make sense," he said quietly, "and no amount of faith seems to change that." The simple acknowledgement of this truth without attempts to explain it away or minimize it left Rebecca momentarily speechless. For weeks, everyone had been trying to comfort her with assurances that her father was in a better place or that God had a plan. Ryder Forrester was the first to simply acknowledge the injustice of it all. "I should check on the horses," he said after a moment, rising from the table. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Turner." As promised, he took his bedroll to the barn, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts. She cleaned the dishes mechanically, watching through the window as lantern light glowed faintly from the barn. Something about the man's presence on her property made the place feel less empty, less abandoned by hope. It was a dangerous feeling, she decided. Dangerous because it couldn't last. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Rebecca would rise to find Ryder already at work, having started the coffee before heading out to check the cattle. They would work side by side throughout the day, fixing fences, moving the herd, repairing the roof damaged in the last storm. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal, their conversations gradually extending beyond the immediate tasks of the ranch. She learned that he'd been a Union soldier despite his young age, enlisting at 17 in the final year of the war. That afterward, he drifted west, working cattle drives and occasionally serving as security for stagecoach lines. That his reputation as a gunman had been built more on a few necessary incidents than any desire for notoriety. "People remember the shots fired," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch. "Not the ones you choose not to take." By the 5th day, Rebecca realized with alarm that she was growing accustomed to his presence, the sound of his boots on the porch, the low hum he made when working with his hands, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him. It was dangerous, this comfort. Ryder Forrester would be gone in 2 more days, and she would be alone again, facing the same impossible situation. That night, a spring storm rolled in with unexpected ferocity. Rain hammered against the cabin roof, and lightning split the sky in blinding flashes. Rebecca lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. When a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the walls, she heard the frightened lowing of the cattle. Without hesitation, she pulled on her boots and coat, grabbing a lantern. Outside, the rain struck her like needles, immediately soaking through her clothing. She had nearly reached the pasture gate when she saw another light bobbing through the darkness, Ryder, already moving toward the frightened herd. They worked together wordlessly, guiding the panicked animals toward the shelter of the stand of trees at the field's edge. The ground quickly turned to mud, making every step treacherous. As Rebecca led a frightened calf to safety, her foot slipped in the muck. She felt herself falling, then strong hands caught her, steadying her. Ryder stood close, rain streaming down his face, his hands still gripping her arms. Lightning flashed, illuminating his features, the concern in his eyes, the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he stepped back. "We should get out of this weather," he shouted over the storm, his voice nearly lost in the thunder. Back at the cabin, they stood dripping on the porch, both soaked to the skin and covered in mud. "You should come inside," Rebecca said impulsively. "You can't stay in the barn tonight. The roof leaks something terrible in that far corner." Ryder hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. "I'll be fine, don't be foolish," she interrupted. "There's no sense in you catching your death when I have a perfectly good floor in here." "I'll get you some blankets." Inside, Rebecca stoked the fire while Ryder removed his muddy boots and coat. She found an old shirt of her father's and handed it to him, along with a blanket. "You can change behind the screen," she said, gesturing to the corner where a wooden privacy screen stood. "I'll make some coffee to warm us up." As the coffee brewed, Rebecca quickly changed into dry clothes behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. When she emerged, Ryder was standing by the fire in her father's shirt, which fit his broader frame more snugly than it had her father's. His hair was damp and curling slightly, and something about seeing him in her home, in her father's clothing, sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. They sat before the hearth, steam rising from their coffee mugs, the storm continuing its assault outside. For a long moment neither spoke, the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain filling the silence. "Thank you," Ryder finally said, "for letting me come in." Rebecca nodded, her eyes fixed on the flames. It seemed the Christian thing to do. A small smile touched his lips. "Is that what it was?" She looked at him then, finding his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What else would it be, Mr. Forrester?" "Kindness," he said simply. "The same kindness you've shown me all week, despite your initial reservations." Rebecca looked away, uncomfortable with his perception. "I've been far from kind. I've been prickly and suspicious and hurting," he finished for her. "You've been hurting." "There's no shame in that." The gentleness in his voice broke something loose inside her, a dam she'd built against her grief. To her horror, Rebecca felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered, the admission tearing from her like a physical wound. "The bank will take everything in 3 weeks. Everything my parents worked for, everything they believed in gone, and I can't stop it." Ryder set his mug aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "How much do you owe?" $200, she said, wiping angrily at a tear that escaped. "Might as well be 2,000 for all the chance I have of raising it." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "There might be a way," he said carefully. "The cattle drive heading north to Montana is leaving from Fort Worth in 2 weeks. They're paying good money for experienced hands." "I can't leave the ranch unattended for that long," Rebecca objected. "No," Ryder agreed, "but I could go. I'm headed north anyway, just not quite that far. I could sign on, work the drive, send the money back to you before the bank comes calling." Rebecca stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." In the firelight, his face was cast in shadow and light, making him appear both vulnerable and strong simultaneously. "Perhaps I see something worth saving here." "The ranch?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Not just the ranch," he replied, holding her gaze until she understood his meaning. Rebecca looked away first, her heart pounding traitorously in her chest. "I couldn't ask that of you." "It's not your burden to bear." "You didn't ask, I offered." He hesitated, then added, "Sometimes accepting help isn't a weakness, Rebecca. Sometimes it's the strongest thing you can do." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, something shifted between them, a recognition that neither was quite ready to name. "We should get some rest," Rebecca finally said, rising from her chair. The storm's not letting up anytime soon. She arranged blankets on the floor near the fire for him, acutely aware of his presence as she moved about the small cabin. When she finally retired behind her curtain, sleep eluded her. She could hear his breathing, steady and deep, from the other side of the thin fabric, and found herself wondering what it might be like to have someone to rely on again, to not face every struggle alone. The thought terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Rebecca emerged from behind her curtain to find Ryder already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. He'd folded his blankets neatly and was once again dressed in his own clothes, now mostly dried. "Good morning," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this after last night." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the cup, and Rebecca felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. "Thank you. For everything." The cattle, staying up the offer to help with the money. He nodded, his expression serious. "I meant what I said. I can make that cattle drive and get the money to you in time." Rebecca studied him, trying to understand this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd stopped believing would be heard. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me or this ranch?" Ryder set his coffee aside and took a step closer to her, close enough that she could see the varying shades of blue in his eyes. "Because in all my wandering, I've rarely met anyone who deserves a fighting chance more than you do." There was something in his gaze, an intensity, a certainty that made her breath catch. For a wild moment, she thought he might kiss her, and even more wildly, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should check the cattle after that storm." Rebecca nodded, grateful for the return to practicality, even as a part of her mourned the moment that had passed. "Yes, of course." They spent the day assessing the storm damage: a section of fence down, a corner of the barn roof in need of repair, cattle scattered but thankfully all accounted for. Working side by side, they accomplished in hours what would have taken Rebecca days on her own. As the sun began to set, they stood looking over the ranch from the small rise behind the cabin. The land stretched out before them, bathed in golden light, 50 acres of tough grassland that had been her family's dream and now threatened to become her personal nightmare. "It's beautiful," Ryder said quietly. "It is," she agreed. "My father always said that God painted his finest pictures at sunset, just to remind us he was still there, even when the darkness came." "You sound like you don't believe that anymore," Rebecca sighed, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "I want to. I used to have such faith in God, in people, in the future. Now, I don't know what I believe anymore, except that I'm alone." Ryder turned to face her, his expression earnest. "You don't have to be, not if you don't want to be." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Rebecca felt a flutter of something long dormant awakening in her chest, hope, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. "You're leaving soon," she reminded him and herself. "Yes," he acknowledged, "but I could come back. After the cattle drive, after I see my uncle, I could come back here." "Why would you?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. Ryder took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because in the span of a week, you've made me question every plan I had. Because for the first time in years, I'm thinking about putting down roots instead of pulling them up. Because when I look at you, Rebecca Turner, I see someone worth coming back for." The honesty in his voice was undeniable, as was the gentle way his hand reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was fleeting but sent warmth cascading through her. "I barely know you," she whispered, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Then let me give you another day to decide," he replied, his voice low. "I'll still leave tomorrow, but I need to know, would you want me to come back when it's done?" Rebecca looked out over the land her parents had loved, then back at the man before her, a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness since his arrival. A man who offered hope when hers had all but vanished. "Yes," she finally said, the word feeling like both a surrender and a victory. "I think I would." The smile that broke across his face was like the sunrise, gradual, then brilliant. "Then that's what I'll do." That evening, their last together before his departure, they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering twilight. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on childhood's dreams. Loss is the kind of sharing that usually takes months somehow compressed into precious hours. My mother used to say that fireflies were God's way of reminding us that even the smallest lights can shine in the darkness, Rebecca said, watching the insects' golden flickers against the deepening blue of dusk. Wise woman, Ryder replied. Is that where you got your faith from, your mother? Rebecca nodded. She had faith enough for the whole territory, never doubted, not even at the end when the pneumonia was taking her breath away. She paused, remembering. Her last words to me were, "Keep believing, Becky. The light always returns, and had it before my father died." Rebecca finished for him. I thought so. We were making it, barely sometimes, but making it. I still believed things would work out somehow. She sighed. Then that bullet found him instead of whoever it was meant for, and I just couldn't see the point anymore. Ryder was quiet for a moment. I lost my faith during the war, he finally said. Saw too many men praying for deliverance that never came. Couldn't reconcile a loving God with the things men did to each other in his name. But you found it again, she asked, remembering how naturally he'd spoken of God throughout the week. He looked at her, his face half in shadow. Not all at once. It came back gradually, like water seeping into parched ground, little moments of grace too perfect to be accidental, sunsets like tonight's, the kindness of strangers when I needed it most. He paused. Meeting you. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. I'm hardly a sign from God, Mr. Forrester, aren't you? He asked softly. I wasn't planning to stop in Redemption Creek. A broken wagon wheel brought me there. I wasn't planning to stay more than a night, but I overheard the sheriff mentioning a young woman struggling alone with her ranch. Some might call those coincidences. I prefer to think of them as guidance. His words stirred something in her, not quite faith returned, but perhaps the first stirrings of its possible rebirth. Could it really be that simple? That the answer to her desperate situation had been guided to her doorstep? As if reading her thoughts, Ryder added, I'm not saying God sent me specifically to help you, Rebecca. I'm just saying that sometimes help comes in unexpected forms, and there's no shame in accepting it as the blessing it might be. They sat in companionable silence as true night fell, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky. When at last they said goodnight, Ryder to the barn for his final night, Rebecca to the cabin, there was an understanding between them. Tomorrow would bring separation, but also possibility. The morning of Ryder's departure dawned clear and bright. Rebecca had risen early to prepare a hearty breakfast, and they ate together at the small table outside the cabin, their conversation light despite the weight of impending farewell. I've written down the details of where to send a telegram if you need to reach me, Ryder said, handing her a folded piece of paper. The cattle drive should reach Fort Benton in about 3 weeks. I'll send the money back with a trusted man as soon as we're paid. Rebecca took the paper, their fingers brushing. I still don't know how to thank you for this. You can thank me by being here when I return, he said simply. After breakfast, Ryder saddled his buckskin while Rebecca packed him provisions for the journey: bread, jerky, coffee, and a small jar of preserves she'd been saving for a special occasion. As he secured his bedroll behind the saddle, Rebecca stood awkwardly nearby, uncertain how to say goodbye to a man who had become so important to her in such a short time. I made something for you, she finally said, holding out a small cloth bag. It's not much, just... Ryder opened it to find a simple leather cord with a small wooden cross pendant. Rebecca, my father carved it, she explained quickly. Said it helped him remember that someone was watching over him when he was away from home. She flushed. I thought maybe you could use the reminder too. Ryder looked at the simple gift with reverence, then slipped the cord over his head, tucking the cross beneath his shirt. I'll treasure it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The moment stretched between them, full of words unsaid. Finally, Ryder reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I will come back, he promised. You have my word. Rebecca nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. On impulse, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Be safe, she whispered. The surprise and pleasure that flickered across his face was worth the boldness of the gesture. With visible reluctance, he mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the ease of a man born to it. 3 weeks, he said, looking down at her. Keep believing, Rebecca. With that, he turned his horse and rode away, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast landscape until he disappeared over the horizon. Rebecca stood watching long after he was gone, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the cheek she'd kissed. 3 weeks suddenly seemed an eternity. The days following Ryder's departure stretched endlessly. Rebecca threw herself into ranch work with renewed purpose, determined that when he returned, if he returned, he would find the place well maintained. She repaired what she could, tended the cattle diligently, and even planted a small vegetable garden beside the cabin. In the evenings, she found herself drawn to her father's Bible, which she retrieved from the drawer where she'd banished it. She didn't read it, not yet, but she kept it on the table, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps she wasn't quite ready to abandon faith entirely. A week passed, then 2. Rebecca made her weekly trip into town for supplies, acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. Word had spread about the famous Ryder Forrester staying at her ranch, and speculation ran rampant about the nature of their relationship. Heard that gunslinger promised to send money back to save your place, Mrs. Wilkins said, not unkindly, as Rebecca selected needles at the general store. You best be careful, dear. Men make all sorts of promises when they're looking to win a woman's favor. Rebecca bristled. Mr. Forrester is a man of his word, Mrs. Wilkins, and whatever arrangement we have is our business alone. The older woman patted her arm condescendingly. Of course, dear. I'm sure he's different from all the other drifters who have passed through town making grand promises. Her words stung because they touched on Rebecca's own deepest fear that Ryder's promises would prove as insubstantial as morning mist. That he would take the money from the cattle drive and disappear, never to return to Redemption Creek or the struggling young woman he'd left behind. As the 3rd week began, Rebecca's anxiety grew. Mr. Hollister from the bank had already visited once, his thinly veiled skepticism about her ability to produce the money evident in every word. The deadline loomed just days away now. Each day, she rode to the edge of her property and scanned the horizon, hoping to see a familiar figure approaching. Each night, she returned to the cabin alone, her hopes dimming with the setting sun. On the morning of the 21st day since Ryder's departure, Rebecca woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Heart pounding, she quickly dressed and rushed outside, only to find not Ryder but a stranger, a weather-beaten man astride a gray horse. Miss Turner. The man called, reining in before the cabin. Yes, she replied cautiously, one hand near the pistol she'd taken to wearing since being alone. Name's Josiah Miller. Ryder Forrester asked me to deliver this to you. He extended a leather pouch. Said to tell you the drive reached Fort Benton 3 days ago, and that he's headed to his uncle's place as planned, but will be back as soon as he can. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she took the pouch. Inside, she found exactly $200, the full amount needed to pay off the bank loan, along with a folded note. Would you like some coffee before you ride on, Mr. Miller? She offered, clutching the pouch tightly. The man smiled kindly. That's generous, miss, but I should be getting back. Got a wife waiting in town. He tipped his hat. Forrester spoke highly of you, said you were the strongest woman he'd ever met. Thought you should know that. After Miller departed, Rebecca sat on the porch steps and carefully unfolded Ryder's note. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the letters flowing across the page with unexpected elegance. Rebecca, the cattle drive went smoothly. Enclosed is the money for the bank. Give it directly to Hollister and make sure he provides a receipt. I hope this finds you well and that the ranch has not presented too many challenges in my absence. I think of you constantly. The wooden cross you gave me has become a comfort I never expected. Each night I hold it and remember your face in the firelight, your strength in adversity, your kindness despite your pain. I am keeping my promise to visit my uncle who has been ailing but will return to Redemption Creek to you as soon as I can. Perhaps by then you will have decided if you truly wish me to stay. Until then, keep believing, not just in me, but in yourself. You are never as alone as you think. Yours, Ryder. Rebecca read the note 3 times, her fingers tracing the signature. Yours. Such a simple word, and yet it carried such weight. She pressed the paper briefly to her heart before carefully folding it and tucking it into her dress pocket. That afternoon, she rode into town and marched directly to the bank. Mr. Hollister's surprise at seeing her money, all of it, in cash, was evident in his raised eyebrows and suddenly respectful tone. "Well, Miss Turner, this is unexpected," he said, counting the bills a second time. "I had been led to believe your circumstances were quite dire." "My circumstances are my own concern, Mr. Hollister," she replied evenly. "The receipt, please." With the debt paid and the receipt safely stored, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The ranch was secure, at least for now. But as she rode home, another weight settled in its place, waiting for Ryder's return, wondering if he truly would come back as promised. Days passed. Rebecca found herself praying again, hesitant, halting prayers at first, then more confident ones as the days wore on. She didn't pray for Ryder's return specifically, but rather for guidance, for strength, for the ability to face whatever came next. One evening, as a spectacular sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca sat on the porch steps, her father's Bible open in her lap for the first time since his death. She read familiar passages, hearing them in her mother's gentle voice, in her father's deep rumble. Words of comfort, of promise, of endurance. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she read aloud, the ancient words washing over her like a balm. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters, he restoreth my soul." As darkness fell, Rebecca remained on the porch, a strange peace settling over her. Whether Ryder returned or not, she would endure, she would find a way forward. The faith that had sustained her parents through hardship began to take root once more in her heart, not naive or unquestioning, but tempered by grief and stronger for it. A full month had passed since Ryder's departure, when the evening calm was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Rebecca had been mending by lamplight and set aside her work, heart hammering as she stepped onto the porch. A lone Ryder approached in the gathering dusk, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even at a distance, she would know that straight-backed posture, the distinctive gait of the buckskin horse. Ryder Forrester had returned. Rebecca stood frozen on the porch, watching as he drew closer. When he reached the yard, he dismounted smoothly, leading his horse the final few paces. In the soft glow from the cabin windows, she could see his face, clearly weary from travel but alight with something that made her breath catch. "Rebecca," he said simply, stopping at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at her. "You came back," she replied, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "I promised I would." He climbed the steps slowly, coming to stand before her, close enough that she could smell the leather and pine scent of him, could see the hope and uncertainty mingling in his blue eyes. "Did you want me to?" Instead of answering, Rebecca closed the distance between them, and with a courage born of waiting and longing, placed her hands on his chest and rose on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. For a moment, Ryder stood perfectly still, as if afraid the slightest movement might shatter the moment. Then his arms came around her, one hand cradling the back of her head as he returned her kiss with gentle fervor. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Rebecca laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Yes," she confirmed. "Yes, I wanted you to come back. Yes, I want you to stay." In the days that followed, they fell into a new rhythm, working the ranch together, sharing meals, talking long into the evenings. Ryder spoke of his visit to his ailing uncle, of the cattle drive's journey north, of his growing certainty with each passing mile that Redemption Creek was where he belonged. "I prayed every night," he confessed one evening as they sat before the fire. "Prayed that you'd be safe, that you'd still want me when I returned, that somehow this might be the beginning of something lasting." "When did you know?" Rebecca asked, her hand entwined with his. "When did you know that this was more than just helping someone in need?" Ryder considered, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. I think I knew that first night in town when I saw you in the general store. You stood so straight, so determined despite everything. But I was certain that night of the storm when you spoke about your father, about losing your faith. I recognized something in you, the same struggle I'd faced, the same questions I'd asked. Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I'm still asking those questions, still trying to understand why good people suffer, why prayers seem to go unanswered. And what have you concluded? He asked gently. She thought for a moment. That maybe faith isn't about having all the answers, maybe it's about continuing to ask the questions, continuing to hope even when hope seems foolish. Ryder pressed a kiss to her temple. That sounds like wisdom to me. As summer bloomed across the Montana territory, so too did the relationship between Rebecca and Ryder. They worked side by side to improve the ranch, adding a new corral, increasing the herd with calves purchased from a neighboring spread, repairing the cabin roof before the next rainy season. Word spread throughout Redemption Creek that the notorious Ryder Forrester had hung up his guns for good, choosing instead the life of a rancher alongside Rebecca Turner. Some scoffed, predicting he would grow restless and move on. Others, seeing the way the couple looked at each other, recognized something rare and genuine. Sheriff Dawson, stopping by one afternoon to warn of rustlers reported in the area, commented on the change. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Rebecca. The famous Ryder Forrester, content to mend fences and chase strays. "Some treasures are worth settling down for, Sheriff," Ryder replied, his gaze finding Rebecca's across the yard. As autumn approached, bringing with it cool nights and golden days, Ryder began riding out early some mornings, returning with an air of secretive purpose. When Rebecca questioned him, he merely smiled and promised all would be revealed in time. On a particularly beautiful September evening, he asked Rebecca to ride with him to the rise behind the cabin where they had stood the night before his departure months earlier. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her mount her horse. They rode in companionable silence, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grassland. When they reached the rise, Rebecca gasped at what awaited them. A small clearing had been prepared, with a simple wooden table set with wildflowers and candles, protected from the breeze by cleverly arranged stones. "Ryder, what is this?" she asked as he helped her dismount. He took her hands in his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "This is the place where I first dared to hope you might want me to return. It seemed fitting it should be the place where I ask if you'll have me forever." Rebecca's heart pounded as Ryder reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a simple gold band that caught the last rays of sunlight. "It was my mother's," he explained, holding it between his fingers. "My uncle kept it for me all these years, waiting until I found someone worthy of it." He took a deep breath. "Rebecca Turner, you restored my faith in God, in goodness, in the possibility of a future worth building. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred her vision as Rebecca gazed at the man before her, this unexpected answer to prayers she'd stopped believing would be heard. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Ryder, yes." His smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Creek, with Sheriff Dawson giving the bride away, and the entire town turning out to witness the union of the reformed gunslinger and the rancher's daughter. Rebecca wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered, and carried wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Ryder stood tall in a new suit, the wooden cross Rebecca had given him visible at his throat. When the traveling preacher asked them to recite their vows, their voices rang clear and sure through the small church. Promises made not just to each other, but to the community that had become their home, to the future they would build together. That evening, as husband and wife sat on the porch of their cabin, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Rebecca rested her head on Ryder's shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. The adventure, the freedom of the trail. Ryder considered her question seriously before answering. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, just me, my horse, and the horizon, but I never miss the loneliness. He pressed a kiss to her hair. What I have now, this land, this home, you is worth more than all the freedom in the world. Rebecca smiled, her hand finding his. My mother used to say that true freedom comes from being exactly where you're meant to be, with exactly who you're meant to be with. Wise woman, Ryder murmured. I wish I could have known her. She would have loved you, Rebecca assured him. Almost as much as I do. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had stood at her father's grave, her faith shattered, her future a bleak and empty road. Now she sat beside her husband, her heart full, her faith restored not to what it had been, a child's unquestioning belief, but to something deeper, something tested by fire and stronger for it. What are you thinking about? Ryder asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Rebecca turned to him, her eyes shining in the starlight. I was thinking about belief, about how sometimes our greatest tests become our greatest blessings. And our greatest losses lead us to our greatest gains, he added softly, understanding. Exactly. She squeezed his hand. If my father hadn't died, if I hadn't lost my way, you might never have stopped here. We might never have found each other. Ryder nodded, his expression solemn. I don't believe your father's death had purpose or meaning in itself. That kind of thinking diminishes real grief. But I do believe that even in our darkest moments, seeds of hope can take root if we let them. Rebecca leaned up to kiss him gently. When did you become so wise, Ryder Forrester? He smiled against her lips. Must be the company I keep, Mrs. Forrester. The name, her new name, still sent a thrill through Rebecca. Mrs. Forrester. Wife to a man who had ridden into her life when all seemed lost and had shown her that faith, like love, sometimes arrived in unexpected packages. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Montana territory in snow before November's end. The cabin, once a place of lonely grief for Rebecca, became a haven of warmth and love. They spent the long evenings planning for spring more cattle, perhaps horses too, improvements to make the ranch not just survive but thrive. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, Ryder and Rebecca sat before the fire, a small fir tree decorated with paper stars and popcorn strings brightening the corner of the room. I have something for you, Rebecca said, reaching behind the sofa to retrieve a carefully wrapped package. Ryder unwrapped it to find a new Bible, bound in rich brown leather with his initials stamped in gold on the cover. Rebecca. He breathed, running his fingers over the tooled leather. Open it, she urged. Inside, on the first page, she had written in her neat hand, to my husband, Ryder. May this guide our family through all the years to come, with endless love, Rebecca. Our family, he repeated, looking up at her with sudden understanding dawning in his eyes. Rebecca, are you? She nodded, her smile luminous. In the summer, Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. Ryder set the Bible carefully aside before gathering her into his arms, his joy too great for words. When he could finally speak, his voice was rough with emotion. A child, our child. The first of many, I hope, Rebecca said, nestling against him. A house full of little Forresters running about, causing all manner of trouble. Just like their mother, Ryder teased, earning a playful swat. That night, as snow continued to fall and the fire burned low, they lay in bed talking of the future names for the baby, additions to the cabin, dreams for the years to come. As Rebecca drifted towards sleep in the circle of her husband's arms, she found herself offering a prayer of gratitude for the man beside her, for the child growing beneath her heart, for the faith that had been restored when she needed it most. Summer arrived in a blaze of wildflowers and endless blue skies. The ranch flourished under their joint care, the cattle fat and healthy, the vegetable garden abundant, the cabin expanded with a new room in anticipation of the child to come. On a sweltering July day, as thunderheads gathered on the distant horizon, Rebecca felt the first pains begin. Ryder, who had scarcely let her out of his sight in the final weeks, immediately rode for town to fetch the doctor and the midwife. Hours later, as lightning flashed and thunder rolled across the prairie, Rebecca labored to bring their child into the world. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, each contraction seeming to tear her apart from within. "I can't," she gasped as another pain seized her. "Ryder, I can't do this." He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in his face etched with concern and love. "You can," he assured her. "You're the strongest person I know, Rebecca Forrester. You can do anything." When her strength flagged and fear threatened to overwhelm her, Ryder did something unexpected. He bowed his head and began to pray aloud, not the formal, distant prayers of church services, but intimate, heartfelt words that seemed to flow directly from his soul. "Lord," he said, still holding her hand, "be with Rebecca now. Give her strength when hers is gone. Give her courage when fear rises. Remind her that she is never alone, that you are here, that I am here, that we walk this path together." As his prayer continued, something shifted within Rebecca. The pain remained, but alongside it grew a certainty, a peace that transcended understanding. She squeezed Ryder's hand, drawing strength from his unwavering faith in her, in them, in the God who had brought them together. "Keep praying," she whispered between contractions. "Please don't stop." And so he prayed through the night, through her cries of pain, through the midwife's instructions, through the moments when it seemed the labor would never end. He prayed until, with a final tremendous effort, Rebecca brought their daughter into the world, a robust, red-faced infant whose lusty cries filled the cabin as the storm outside began to abate. "A girl," the midwife announced, placing the swaddled infant in Rebecca's arms. "A perfect little girl." Rebecca looked down at their daughter, overwhelmed by a love so immediate and vast it took her breath away. When she glanced up at Ryder, she saw tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he gazed at the tiny being they had created. "Faith," Rebecca said softly. "Her name is Faith." Ryder smiled through his tears, understanding perfectly. "Faith Forrester," he agreed, gently touching his daughter's tiny hand. "A perfect name for a perfect girl." In the days that followed, as Rebecca recovered and baby Faith settled into life outside the womb, the new parents marveled at the miracle they had been granted. Neighbors and townspeople came to offer congratulations and gifts: handmade blankets, tiny clothes, practical items for the baby's care. Sheriff Dawson arrived with a beautifully carved wooden cradle, a hidden talent for woodworking revealed in its elegant lines. "Thought the little one might need a proper place to sleep," he said gruffly, clearly embarrassed by Ryder's heartfelt thanks. Even Mrs. Wilkins, who had been so skeptical of Ryder's promises, came bearing a quilt she had made herself. "Never been so happy to be wrong about a man," she confided to Rebecca as she admired the baby. "You found yourself a good one, dear." As summer gave way to autumn, the little family settled into new rhythms. Ryder took on more of the ranch work, insisting Rebecca rest and recover fully. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Faith nestled in her mother's arms, watching the sunset paint the sky in ever-changing hues of gold and crimson. "I was thinking," Ryder said one such evening, "about the day I first rode onto this land. About how lost you were, how your faith was nearly gone." Rebecca nodded, remembering those dark days with a clarity that had not diminished. "I thought God had abandoned me, that I was meant to face everything alone." "And now?" he asked gently. She looked down at their daughter, sleeping peacefully against her breast, then up at the man who had changed her world. "Now I understand that sometimes our greatest tests become the foundation for our greatest joys. That faith isn't about never doubting, it's about continuing to hope even when hope seems foolish." Ryder smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as gentle as it had been that first night in the storm-darkened cabin. "I think that's the truest kind of faith there is." As the years passed, the Forrester ranch prospered. They added more land, more cattle, built a larger home to accommodate their growing family. Faith was joined by a brother, Samuel, 2 years later, and finally by twins, Elizabeth and Joseph, 3 years after that. Ryder's reputation as a gunslinger faded into legend, replaced by his standing as one of the territory's most respected ranchers. Rebecca, once pitied as the orphan daughter struggling alone, became known for her strength, her wisdom, and her unwavering support of her husband and children. Together, they weathered the challenges that came: harsh winters, dry summers, economic downturns, childhood illnesses. Through it all, the faith that had begun with a cowboy kneeling to pray beside a grieving woman sustained them, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Ryder surprised Rebecca by taking her back to the rise where he had proposed, now the site of a small gazebo surrounded by wildflowers. "You remember what you said to me the night Faith was born?" he asked as they stood hand in hand, looking out over the land that had become the foundation of their lives. Rebecca smiled, the memory still vivid after all these years. "I said many things that night, most of them probably not fit for polite company." Ryder laughed, the sound as dear to her now as it had been the first time she heard it. "You said her name should be Faith, and when I asked why, you said, because faith brought us together and faith will see us through." "And has it not?" she asked softly. "Every day," he affirmed, drawing her into his arms. "Every single day." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Rebecca Turner Forrester offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the man who had knelt beside her when her faith was nearly gone, for the family they had created, for the love that had restored her belief in possibilities. In the distance, the laughter of their children carried on the evening breeze, a joyful counterpoint to the peace that filled her heart. Faith had not protected them from life's sorrows and struggles, but it had given them the strength to face them together, to find beauty even in the darkest moments, to build something lasting and true in a world that often seemed chaotic and cruel. "I love you, Rebecca Forrester," Ryder murmured against her hair, "today and always." "And I love you," she replied, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken. "My cowboy who prayed until I believed again." Together, they walked back toward the house, toward their children, toward their future, toward all the days yet to come, hand in hand, faith guiding every step.